So, about 4 months ago, I began working on this project to replace the wire rack shelves in my friend's pantry, and I came up with this design. In part 1 of the series, I built the pull-out folding step stool so we could fully utilize the pantry's 9-foot ceiling. In part 2, I built the rest of the shelving. And then in part 3, I did the finishing and installed all the LED lights. Now, the last thing I needed to do before install was make the Lazy Susans for the corner. A Lazy Susan can be as simple or as fancy as anyone could want, and I started mine by milling up some beech hardwood and cutting it in short lengths with 22.5-degree angled ends. Essentially, I'm making an octagon that I'm going to cut a circle out of for the outer border of the Lazy Susan. Anyway, I'm cutting these mitered ends of the 8 segments on the table saw with an Incra miter gauge that's been dropped a few times and needs some adjustment. Consequently, my miters aren't as accurate as they need to be, but that's okay because of how I'm going to put this octagon together. Even having an angle off by 1/10 of a degree will compound into some big gaps with as many joints as there are in these octagons. So to counter that, I initially glued the rings up as halves. You'll notice that I don't put glue in 2 of the joints on this glue up. As long as the other 6 joints in the octagon are tight, it doesn't matter that there are gaps in the unglued joints at this point. I added this bar clamp to keep the pressure on the glued joints and open the unglued ones up a little bit more. End grain joints aren't the strongest, so it's essential that the surfaces of both sides match up perfectly. After the 2 halves of the octagon had dried, I took the clamps off and attached one of the halves to a piece of plywood using some double-sided tape. I positioned it with the end sticking off over the edge just a tiny bit. Then I ran that through the table saw and took off just enough to get the 2 ends coplanar. I repeated this again on the other half of the octagon. This made those remaining 2 joints match perfectly. I sanded all the joints flush to remove any glue squeeze out or slight offsets so the octagons would lay perfectly flat for circle cutting. I stuck the octagon down on a square of plywood that had a hole drilled in the exact center. Double-sided tape holds the octagon down and some screwed-on brackets keep it from moving. I put together a quick circle cutting jig from my trim router and began cutting the inside of the circle. I did this in 3 passes, cutting a 1/4 inch at a time. An 1/8 inch drill bit makes the pivot point, though for a few of these I also used a small screwdriver. I did this in multiple passes for a few reasons. First, I didn't want to overburden the router or the bit by trying to plow through 3/4 inch thick hardwood in a single go. Second, the bit can loosen up and drop lower than intended when doing this, and in my experience that happens more often than not when taking too deep of a pass. I checked to make sure the bit was still correctly seated and retightened the collet between each go around the circle. Once the inner side of the circle was cut, I took the octagon off the jig. I didn't want to cut the outer curve of the circle until after the center of the disc was glued in. To facilitate that, I cut a 5/8 inch deep rabbet on the lower side of the octagon. I did this in 5 passes because I really didn't want any splintering and I was concerned that if the bit caught and through the octagon, even a little, I might bust a glue joint. Luckily, neither of those things happened. I was going to glue a disc of 1/2 inch plywood into that ring, which of course I first needed to cut out. My quickly made circle cutting jig got a lot of use on this project. The birch veneer on the plywood wasn't going to cut it for this project, so I cut some beech veneers on the bandsaw and got them to a uniform thickness with the drum sander. I needed 24 of these little slices since I did 8 per Lazy Susan, and I made a few extra, so the sanding took some time to complete. Each disc has 8 separate pieces of veneer, kinda like a pizza. I made a rough template that was a few degrees beyond 45 so I could be sure there would be enough veneer for full coverage on top of the plywood discs. I roughly cut these out with the bandsaw and then jointed the edges straight with a shooting plane. A shooting plane is probably one of the best and most enjoyable tools there is to use. It's perfect for things like these and gets the edges of the veneers extremely smooth and straight. I cut these veneers the way I did on a similar principle to why I did the outer ring the way I did that one. Any small variation in the angle of the veneers would throw the entire thing off and cause gaps, so better to cut them all a little oversized, tape them together in halves, and then joint one edge straight. I wasn't at all concerned about making sure that the 8 wedges of the veneer were the exact same size, and that made this all the easier to do. This time I jointed the edge with a flush cut bit on the trim router instead of with a table saw. Once the edges of 2 circle halves were jointed, I taped the entire thing together to make a full circle and then glued that down to a plywood disc. The white paper below the veneer is parchment paper, so any squeeze-out glue wouldn't fuse the veneer to anything that I didn't want it glued to. I also used a vacuum press to clamp everything tight while the glue set up. Whatever overhang there was on the veneer was trimmed off with the router. I sanded the discs completely before I glued them into the outer rings. After the glue dried, I cut the Lazy Susan disc round. This time I did one pass with the trim router to establish a circle, then I cut the excess off with a bandsaw, and I finished the circle on a router table with a flush cut bit. This finished the actual surface of the Lazy Susan, but I wanted to add some sort of rim to keep things from falling off while it spinned. I settled on making another ring that would be elevated with standoffs to form a barrier around the disc. This time I elected to put some faith into my miter saw, which turned out to be dead on accurate for the 22.5 degree cuts. These joints won't have the luxury of being glued to a disc of plywood to add strength, so splines would be in order. I made a simple jig to support the parts as I cut slots for splines into the end grain. I cut every one of them twice on each side of the fence to make sure the slots would be perfectly centered on the 1/2 inch thick stock. I cut the splines themselves out of some walnut for a nice little contrasting color detail. I glued the splines in with the grain perpendicular to the joint for maximum strength. Because these miters were actually cut to the right degrees, I was able to glue everything together in one go rather than the way I did the first rings. These rings were cut out similarly to the rings that I did earlier, except this time I cut a single pass on the outside and then cut the inner parts of the circle with 2 passes. I didn't completely cut the outer curve with this jig because if I did that I would lose the holding power from the brackets that I had screwed down, and the double-sided tape wouldn't be enough to keep the ring from moving around. That could get dangerous. Like the outside curves on the lower discs, I removed the excess on the bandsaw and then used a flush trim bit to finish them off. So that's how I made the rims for the Lazy Susans, but to elevate them above the lower discs, I needed some standoffs. I settled on using 1/2-inch dowels, and I used this template to make sure that the holes would line up perfectly between the lower and upper parts. The black marks that I'm drawing on now are to index the holes, so regardless of any minor variations in my template, the holes will line up. I don't know about you, but 1/2-inch beach dowels aren't readily available anywhere I shop, so I had to make some. I cut 1/2-inch square stock on the table saw and then used a 1/4-inch round over bit to make something pretty close to a round dowel. This works pretty good, but my dowels were just a little too wide, so after I cut the square ends off of them, I used the lathe to achieve final roundness. I probably could have as easily done this with a drill if it had a big enough chuck. While the dowel was spinning, I used a 1/2-inch wrench to burnish the dowel flat into a uniform width along the entire length. Then I gave the dowels a quick sanding before cutting them into the standoffs. At this point, I'm just friction fitting the pieces, and the entire thing came together perfectly. While I was drilling all the holes for the standoffs, I realized that I also needed to have a way to attach the actual bearing mechanism to the Lazy Susan and the pantry shelves. I didn't want to leave an access hole for the screws because that would be unsightly. The bearings came with these little pads, and I decided to use those as little posts for the actual discs to sit and be held in place upon, and then attach the bearings to the shelves with hardware. I wanted the Lazy Susans to be removable if they didn't prove to be useful, and I didn't want rough screw holes, so I put in some threaded inserts. This actually ended up holding the discs in surprisingly well, though at least one of the black shelf support rods still needs to come out to install or remove the Lazy Susans, but that's not that hard to do. I also wanted to make these little removable risers for the center of the Lazy Susans. The idea for this corner of the pantry has always been that the Lazy Susans will hold a large quantity of spices and seasoning mixes, so the containers in the middle could be up higher and easier to see. I basically just cut some circles out of plywood and then added layers until they were high enough. This was all going really well until the blade on my bandsaw broke. Luckily I had a spare, so things didn't slow down too much. I wasn't going to leave the plywood edges visible, so I cut some very thin veneers to cover them up. Steam bending this was completely unnecessary. The veneer was thin enough and the radius large enough that it wouldn't have cracked. I actually only used the steam on the first pedestal, on the other two I didn't bother. I hadn't gotten the circumference quite right, so I trimmed the veneer down before gluing it onto the pedestal. I let this dry overnight and then trimmed the veneer flush before sanding. The veneer on the other two didn't line up as well as on the first one, so I added little trim strips over the gaps, but I didn't film that. Over the course of making the Lazy Susans, I got pretty sick of cutting circles, so for the pedestal tops I just did it the easy and less precise way. I did a sort of bullnose roundover and then glued the tops on. I also glued the rest of the Lazy Susans themselves together. There was a lot of sanding that I didn't film, but rest assured these were all properly sanded. I finished with 3 coats of General Finishes Armor Seal and then polished them with steel wool and paste wax. I included a more detailed demonstration of this in the previous video of the series if you're interested. A little bit of felt on the bottom of the pedestals finished them off. When I thought I was done, I realized that the aluminum of the bearings was just too unsightly, so I painted them to match all the other metal or 3D printed parts in the pantry. That looked way better, and now I was finally done with the pantry construction. So let me get a little bit into the why of these Lazy Susans, because to some it might seem like an odd design choice. My friend who asked me to build this pantry out for him is really big into smoking and grilling meat and has a self-described addiction to buying different rubs and seasonings. So he has something like 100 different kinds of seasonings and spices and stuff on hand that were becoming a real problem to store and actually be able to see everything. So the reason we went with the Lazy Susans is I did the math. Each one of these will hold about 30 of these big rub containers. And the reason why we put the little pedestal in the middle is so when there's a lot, you can still kind of see the ones in the middle. Now the pedestals, they're totally removable. They just sit there because as he uses the pantry and everything and kind of fills in the space, I wanted to have some flexibility to make it, if this is actually needed or not, which is also why these are fairly easy to remove, although you do have to remove one of these light rods to be able to get it out, but it's not the end of the world. Anyway, that was the reasoning behind all these different Lazy Susans. In my initial design, I was going to have a pole going up the middle and have them all connected, like you turn one and they all turn, but that started to seem really complicated, so I went with the 3 independent ones, and that also, like I said, lends some flexibility to be able to remove them if if that's what's desired. Now, in my last video, I had said I was gonna also do some pull-out spice shelves, kind of like the ones you see on the internet. And so I made this as a prototype. And problem was that for maybe somebody with a relatively small collection of spices, they would have worked fine. But there's so much space lost to a pull-out shelf and the drawer mechanism and everything that this would only hold like 5 or 6 of these big ones and quite a few of these smaller ones up here. And for the smaller ones, that probably would have been fine. But for these bigger ones, it just didn't make sense. And the only shelf tall enough to even get this much in is this lower one. The rest of these are only 12-inch shelves, and a little bit is lost because of the light bar at the top. Had this been the plan from the get-go, I would have designed the shelves a little bit differently, eliminated one shelf and made a little more vertical space to be able to fit these. But still, a lot of shelf space would be lost that is going to be needed to store other food. So ultimately, we got rid of this idea. That's why I didn't end up including it in the video other than to explain what happened. So over the past 4 months or so, I've been able to build this in my shop with plenty of space, and now it was time to take everything apart and try to install it into the 4-foot square pantry. I had envisioned a more comprehensive installation section of this video when I began this project, but the realities of trying to do the install while filming got in the way. The space that these pieces had to fit into was small and very uncomfortable.
What? Like the back of a Volkswagen?
The two of us managed to squeeze everything into the pantry in a very specific order, and I filmed what I could. In addition to being attached to each other, the shelf modules were screwed to the studs and the wiring was connected for the lights. The lights themselves plug into an outlet on a switch that is up near the ceiling. As a reminder, here's where this pantry started and here's where it ended. And the pull-out folding step stool, which is the hardest part of this project by far, works as intended. This was a long and challenging project for me, and I think the results speak for themselves. What was once a dark, crowded storage space is now well lit, functional, and as optimized as it can be. I hope you enjoyed seeing the process of finishing this pantry, and if you made it this far, thanks for watching.
You're still here? It's over. Go home.